It didn't come about 70 years ago because of necessarily outbreaks of disease in the way that it serves now. It was actually concerns during the Korean War that there might be bioterrorism used against America. And so what the government wanted was people who were trained in containment, trained in detecting who is sick with what, where, could that be a sign of a bioterrorist attack? It turned out that did not happen, thankfully, right? Those kinds of weapons were not levied against the American people, but that's the legacy of the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And throughout history, they have discovered Legionnaire's disease. We all know about Legionella. It was an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer investigating an outbreak in Philly who discovered what that was. Hunter's disease in the Four Corners in the American Southwest. There's been all these quite significant public health breakthroughs that have been done by EIS officers.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, president of the BPL and host of our Arc of History series. Tonight's conversation is part of our Arc of History Repairing America series and presented in conjunction with the Lowell Institute, a longtime sponsor of lectures and programs at both the Boston Public Library and our production partner for tonight, the GBH Forum Network. I'm coming to you live from the Central Library here in Copley Square, from the Bates Hall Reading Room. That's not a virtual background behind me. This is the spot where visitors have pursued research and study interests for over 125 years. And we look forward to welcoming patrons back in person in hopefully the not too distant future. Tonight, we are in conversation with our guest, Dr. Seema Yasmin. Dr. Yasmin is an Emmy Award-winning medical journalist and frequent CNN analyst. As a former officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the CDC, she was deployed as a strategic advisor to foreign governments, won awards from the US Public Health Service for leading epidemic investigations, and was principal investigator for scientific studies on disease outbreaks and their long-term consequences. Yasmin trained in medicine at the University of Cambridge and in journalism at the University of Toronto. She practiced medicine in the UK's National Health Service, completed a fellowship in mathematical modeling at UCLA, and conducted disease modeling research in sub-Saharan Africa. She is the author of 2 published books and 3 forthcoming books. The already published books, The Impatient Dr. Lang, One Man's Fight to End the Global HIV Epidemic, Muslim Women Are Everything, Stereotype-Shattering Stories of Courage, Inspiration, and Adventure, and the forthcoming, 2 of which I believe are already out, Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them, which we'll be discussing tonight, and a book of poetry entitled If God is a Virus. And then in 2022, expected is the Essential Handbook on Science and Medical Journalism. Dr. Yasmin, welcome to the program. This experience and all of your credentials sounds like exactly what we need to rely on at these trying times as we face a global pandemic. But first, would you give us a little insight into your work as a field epidemiologist and how you got interested in this area?
For sure. And first, I just want to say thank you, David, and to yourself and everyone at the Boston Public Library for inviting me to have this conversation today. I'm a little bit jealous that you get to be inside an actual library. We can talk later about why libraries are especially significant to me and why they are places of safety for me. So I can't wait until libraries fully reopen and I can go spend hours in one again.
It's not quite the same without members of the public here, but I'll take it for now.
So it still looks so beautiful with the lamps and the tables, and I can imagine what it smells like and how cozy it feels. So yeah, it'll be nice to have bodies in there for sure. So yeah, I moved to the US about 10 years ago, specifically to serve as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And what had happened was I'd gone to med school. I wanted to care for patients and I was working as a hospital doctor. When I started to get a little bit frustrated that I felt we were operating kind of a revolving door, especially in the ER. I felt like I was seeing the same patients week after week or month after month, and that it was expected of me that my job was to basically patch people up so that they were well enough to go home. And that was kind of it. except I worked in an area where I grew up in East London, where we had lots of commercial sex workers, we had homeless people, we had injecting drug users, we had people who were really vulnerable. And so, you'd see them one week with an infection because they'd been injecting drugs, for example. And then the next time you saw them, you'd be diagnosing them with hepatitis C or HIV. And I thought, this is not right, and I'm saying that about the British health system, the NHS, which is free at the point of care. And I think an efficient and good health system, and clearly still highly imperfect. So one of my mentors, Dr. Lynn Paxton, who's American, she had served as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service, I think in the 90s, and she was still at CDC at the time. And she said, you're frustrated. And I think what that's telling me is that you're actually really interested in public health and why people get sick in the first place, so social determinants of health. And she said, you can do some work with the CDC and join the Epidemic Intelligence. I hadn't even heard of it really, or taken it seriously up until that point. And she said, she was describing to me exactly what it was. So she said, it's this group of doctors and scientists who are recruited by the CDC to work for the federal government as its group of disease detectives. So that anywhere that there's a hint of an outbreak, it could be something completely novel, it could be something we know quite well, could be a small outbreak, could be big, could be domestic, could be international. The US government has on reserve this cohort of people who are trained to be deployed. She said it's really competitive and they don't take many non-Americans because it's part of the military, it's part of the US Public Health Service, but she wanted me to give it a try. So I applied and I got in, and I moved to the US in 2011, not knowing exactly what to expect, but it was a fascinating job and an incredible way to be of service, because basically what happens is your phone rings on any given day and you don't know where you're going to be sent and you don't always know what's happening. So I'll give you one example. There was this one time when I got the call that there was a maximum security men's prison in Arizona where men had suddenly become paralyzed. Healthy men, they're working out 1 minute, completely frozen, could not even breathe after a few minutes. So their speech was slurring, their eyelids were heavy, and then they couldn't breathe. So I get sent to this maximum security men's prison. There's all this politics to deal with. The warden wants help, but doesn't want me going in. Maybe they don't want me to see. I don't know. You don't know. And at the beginning, sometimes you have a differential, like when you have a patient in front of you, okay, it's paralysis. Okay, it started from head to toe or it went from toe to head. What could it be? But it's really detective work. And that's why one of the names for this group of field epidemiologists, one of the nicknames for EIS officers is disease detectives. And it's often how I get introduced, because yes, you're dealing with a contagion, but you're really piecing together so many moving pieces of data to figure out, okay, I think it's this disease. I think it got spread through this. And here's how we're going to try and contain it so that more people don't become sick.
Yeah, I had not heard of that department or division until researching tonight's program. And I guess what you described, it truly is. You call the FBI or the CIA or the EIS. And
this is the medical version, right? And you'll be interested to know this because this year is the 70th anniversary. So I'm going to be hosting a special event, I think, next month to commemorate this. But it didn't come about 70 years ago because of necessarily outbreaks of disease in the way that it serves now. It was actually concerns during the Korean War that there might be bioterrorism used against America. And so what the government wanted was people who were trained in containment, trained in detecting who is sick with what, where, could that be a sign of a bioterrorist attack? It turned out that did not happen, thankfully, right? Those kinds of weapons were not levied against the American people, but that's the legacy of the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And throughout history, they have discovered Legionnaire's disease. We all know about Legionella. It was an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer investigating an outbreak in Philly who discovered what that was. Hunter's disease in the Four Corners in the American Southwest. There's been all these quite significant public health breakthroughs that have been done by EIS officers. And for anyone who watched Contagion, when it came out the same year that I joined the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And of course, Kate Winslet plays an EIS officer, very Hollywood version. So we went to watch it as a group and to say, oh, we were the annoying people in the movie theater. That's not what happened. But some of it is actually true. And I made a video for Wired last year about what in that movie actually does relate to the pandemic right now and what was pure Hollywood.
Now, I think we have a shot of you in the field as well. Maybe we could bring that up and have you talk about, was this during your EIS deployments or was this at another time?
This was when I was an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer during one of my first outbreaks. And I tell you, David, I was so terrified and so embarrassed during this epidemic, and not because of the disease. I was 29. I think I had this kind of young naivety, I don't know, where I was like, I won't get sick. So I wasn't worried about the disease. Yeah. I was absolutely petrified of dogs. And what had happened, one of my first outbreak investigations, I get told, you need to go to this Apache reservation in Arizona. And by the way, it's a 5-hour drive from Phoenix Airport, and I'd never driven an American car. And I was like, I'm driving on the wrong side of the road in the wrong side of the car. And I was convinced I was going to get in a car crash on the way to my first epidemic investigation. I turn up and it's a really awful, awful outbreak because there was a bacterial infection spreading through the reservation and through some other nearby reservations too. This bacteria was being spread through ticks who would bite people and spread the bacterial infection. The disease, many people may have heard of it, was Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I think I spent about 5 minutes learning about that in med school. It is not a thing that happens in England. And even my American colleagues would say, yeah, we thought that happened like more around the Carolinas or like, you know, the East Coast or something. But because of climate change, there was a new kind of spread, a new trend in this disease in that it was affecting people in the Southwest. So I turn up and I'm like, okay, mostly it's kids that are dying from this bacterial infection. Of course, I'm going to be asked to do all the unglamorous, but the bread and butter of an outbreak investigation. You go door to door, you do case finding, you do contact tracing, you gather specimens, you're trying to find your patient zero, all of this stuff. No, I get told from the bosses in Atlanta, right, you were there, we need you to get the ticks. I'm like, that's fine, I'm not especially scared of ticks. But they said, you need to catch stray dogs and pull engorged ticks, the ones that look fattest because they've got the most blood in them, off the dogs. And I was thinking, they're going to send me back to England. Like, how I'm 29 and I'm an EIS officer. How do I say, I'm really sorry, however, I am petrified of dogs and I cannot approach a dog to take a tick off them? And I was so scared. I was thinking, God, I'm not scared of the disease. I'm not scared of the ticks. I'm scared of these dogs. And of course, these were stray dogs. So they weren't like your lovely manicured chihuahuas or whatever. These were really poor, mangy looking dogs with patches of hair missing. And I will never forget, about halfway through the investigation, a senior scientist from CDC in Atlanta came to visit me. And she is the world authority on tick-borne diseases. Jenny McQuiston is her name. She's an incredible veterinarian and scientist. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I cannot be scared of dogs around this woman. She's a vet and an expert. And I remember this one time trying to catch a stray dog and it running and me running away from it. And this world expert screaming at me, don't run away from dogs. And I was like, lady, I'm sorry. I am so scared. It was all the wrong thing to do. What happened though, was in the course of that epidemic, of course I was going to approach the dogs. The kids were dying. I had to. I started realizing that dogs are really lovely. And although I'd spent like 29 years of my life at that point crossing the road, I was so scared of dogs. I had no reason to be it was more of a cultural thing and I wasn't familiar with them. That epidemic made me fall in love with dogs so much that I then went home and adopted a dog.
It is. I'm glad it had a happy ending for you and your love of dogs, and certainly for us at home. Hamlet's been a great addition during this time of the pandemic.
Dogs, yeah.
And we will turn our attention to the pandemic in a minute or two.
And now I just want to talk about dogs, please, for the remainder of the time.
So one of the books we're featuring tonight, which is Viral BS, the medical myths and why we fall for them. So, would you tell us why you wanted to write this particular book?
Sure.
And there's some fascinating little anecdotes throughout the book. Some seem more lighter-hearted, and others are actually pretty serious, serious connections. Topics like do bad teeth cause heart disease? Can gay and bisexual men donate blood? Does debunking a myth help it spread? I mean, these are interesting topics from all sorts of different perspectives.
Yeah, so I have to tell you, I am a reader. I am a hoarder of books. I am a visitor of libraries. My friends make fun of me for how many books I have. I never thought I would be a writer. But what happened during epidemics, I got sent on so many. And David, every time I realized, okay, I'm being deployed to the field. 1 week it's this place, 1 week it's this other place. It's a prison, it's a hospital, it's a border town, wherever it is. I get sent with this singular focus on a virus or a bacteria, something spreading, except it was never just a pathogen that was spreading in isolation. So this is 10, 11 years ago, right? I was noticing that everywhere I got sent, there were rumors, there were medical myths, there were health hoaxes, there was misinformation and disinformation about health. And it directly was impacting the epidemic. Because sometimes, yeah, it was bizarre. It was an outbreak of paralysis. There were 2 of those, in fact, but sometimes, most of the time, the bane of my life when I was in the Epidemic Intelligence Service was whooping cough, measles, mumps. Actually, these diseases that I'd mostly seen in textbooks, because when I was in med school in the early 2000s in England, we weren't seeing a ton of those infections because we got vaccinated, right? They were more like, oh, those are like more older diseases, right? You don't see measles all the time right now like people used to. I was seeing so many epidemics of this in the US. I was even seeing kids die from diseases that you could protect them against with a vaccine.
In the US, we're not talking about some of the global deployments you've been on at this point.
In the US, and I just like, oh, that feels like a punch to the stomach. Like these kids don't get to become adults because somebody chose to not vaccinate them. And I thought, why am I being sent and deployed each time with a focus on the disease, but not all of the misinformation and disinformation around the disease? I thought this is a weird separation of the information ecosystem versus the disease ecosystem. And actually, as we are seeing during the pandemic, it's all so connected, right? Rumors will fuel an outbreak. Rumors will stop people getting vaccinated. Rumors will have people ingesting bleach, because someone suggested that. And I thought, gosh, here I am, a public health doctor with very little expertise in how to communicate with the public and how to cut through the crap, to be honest, how to convince somebody that what they've heard, what they've seen on YouTube, viral videos about don't get vaccinated. I don't know how to counter that. I don't have the skills. And so I thought to myself, I love being a public health doctor, but I'm not sure how effective a public health doctor I can be. I really need to study how information spreads and how you can tell compelling stories and give good information about health. And so I did something really weird, and I left the CDC after a few years, and I went to journalism school. And I didn't know what that would lead to. I didn't know how I was going to use it, but I just felt like these are important skills that I need to learn. And when I was in journalism school, as I was about to graduate, I got a job offer from a newspaper in Texas, the Dallas Morning News. And I thought, oh, I've never been to Texas. Didn't think I'd ever go to Texas, but I want to use these new skills that I have. So I arrived in Texas, in Dallas, in 2014, right as the Ebola epidemic is getting really, really bad in West Africa. My friends, my former colleagues are deployed. They're in the white hazmat suits. And I felt really guilty because I thought, I have the skill set to do that. Why am I not there? Why am I in Dallas, Texas, about to start a job as a journalist, a health journalist? And then, of course, if you remember what happened in 2014, Ebola arrived in Dallas. Literally, I was still unpacking boxes in my house. And we had a West African man from Liberia, poor guy, who got sick. He was infected with Ebola and he died in a Dallas hospital. And suddenly all of my worlds collided. And I tell you that story because it was my experience kind of in the Epidemic Intelligence Service and then as a journalist that made me think there is so much BS circulating about our bodies, about our environment, about medicines. And so I started a column in addition to my reporting, and the column was called Debunked. And basically every week I take a question from readers about vaccines or about cholesterol lowering drugs. People would ask me, should I smoke e-cigarettes or not? Are the chemtrails in the sky, the airplanes leave behind, are they actually poisonous? And so I do a column kind of dissecting it. The column became this book. So that's the story behind Viral BS.
And you mentioned the Ebola. Well, actually, I think we have a picture of you reporting in your suit. So why don't we start there and come back to the thread I was going to go on. So
Sure.
here you are reporting from the field somewhere, and
I'll tell you where.
Tell us what's going on.
So this to me, okay, so I'm in a kind of like a hazmat suit, the kind of suit you need to be wearing with its own oxygen supply if you are working with Ebola, right? Because you want to be safe. However, I am in Galveston, Texas. To anyone who's been to Galveston, Texas, or knows much about it, I mean, it's beautiful. I actually really like it there. It has a history of not doing well with the weather, right? I think we know about Galveston and kind of hurricanes and natural disasters. However,
it's also a vacation spot, I think.
It's gorgeous. And, rightly so, I would definitely vacation there. However, is that the place where you would build a laboratory that houses Ebola infected monkeys and anthrax and yellow fever and West Nile virus? Because this was a national laboratory, an incredible one, super high grade. This amazing woman ran it. And I went to visit to see what a Texas scientist doing in Galveston that could save the world from Ebola, because they were way ahead in working on a vaccine for Ebola. And I was literally walking through labs that had freezers full of anthrax and yellow fever. And, one of the senior scientists that was showing me around, who I was interviewing, he kind of chuckled because he was like, you're here because there's an Ebola epidemic in West Africa, but we've had Ebola in Texas for years. People just don't think about it. And he meant in the freezers. Right. And so I was there to kind of take readers behind the scenes of what it's like to be a scientist who works with Ebola. And actually, in the case of one of the guys I was shadowing, dreams of Ebola at night. The guy used to dream that he was working on it while not wearing any protection, no suit, nothing. And one of the things I wrote about in the article was how long it takes to put on that suit. I think it takes about 30 minutes. And it took about 45 minutes to take it off, including a chemical shower. Wow. And you see the duct tape. I was wearing, literally like walking a mile in someone else's shoes, right? That was me trying to describe to our readers, the Dallas Morning News, this is what's happening in your state. This is where your taxpayer money is going. It's funding this research that could save the planet from Ebola. And by the way, because it takes 30 minutes to get into the suit and 45 minutes to get out, you need to have a really strong bladder. Otherwise, you will not be a successful Ebola scientist. But as a reporter, I love giving people those details about the science, but also what it's like to be a person that does that research. And one of my favorite things, because it was so clunky, walking around in that, you've got those yellow tubes attached to oxygen cylinders in the ceiling. This petite woman who runs that lab and was showing me around, she had a couture, tailor-made hazmat suit. It was handcrafted in Paris, especially for her. So all of those like details that you may not always get, like I love getting those juicy details for the readers. But yeah, that was 2014 when things were getting really, really bad.
And did you get a sense really from your work that by being in the field and telling people what's actually going on and giving us, as you've done tonight, some images of what this looks like, does that build trust in the information? I mean, is that journalism's role, or is that science's role, or really you're at the intersection of both in some ways?
Yeah, so the feedback I would get from readers, and one thing that I was dubbed was like the voice of calm and reason. Well, when we had that one poor man with Ebola, he died, and then 2 nurses who cared for him became infected, right? Thankfully, they both survived. But at any given time, we had about 2 cases of Ebola in Texas. And yet we had governors and senators calling for Texas to be shut down. We had just extreme reactions. We had people of African descent in Texas being told don't go to work by their employers because what they knew of Ebola was Africa. Like there was so much ignorance. And so by going into the field, by collecting the stories, by humanizing this, You actually, by giving more information, can dissipate the fear, because you're describing exactly how it spread. You're describing how carefully the researchers and how diligently they're working to find a vaccine, and all of that stuff really connects people with the information. And it's not just about dry facts. And this is why I get very frustrated with public health agencies that are like, oh, we'll counter anti-vaccine movements with a PowerPoint or with a pamphlet. It doesn't work, and it's been studied for years to not work. You have to engage people with stories, real life stories based on data that, you know, millions of data points are like whoosh over our head. You need to connect with people. And I think that's what good journalism can do.
And we've just stumbled or come across, I think, one dimension that we've experienced over the last year by associate, well, and before, because you just talked about Ebola and its association with Africa, and then all of these stereotypes and fears come into play. We've just experienced this with the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the U.S. as simply one example. You know, in both cases, here we are associating a disease with a location. And I think you make the point even in the section on in Viral BS about donating blood, that it's not where you're from, it's not who you are. It may be about what you do or what you don't do. And so this, it's just, it strikes me as a shame that that's still a bias that we have not overcome either as a nation or as a species.
Still, and it's so much of it is rooted in ignorance, right? And I think it's so unscientific sometimes, the way that those scientific apparently policies are made. Like there used to be an outright lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood, but what if those queer men were monogamous? What if they only ever practiced safer sex? What about heterosexual people who weren't monogamous? Why were they considered less of a risk to the blood supply? So there's these bizarre stigmas. I say bizarre assumes that we don't know why they arise, but I think that we know that they arise because of ignorance. And, you know, I actually got interested in viruses in my teens because of the HIV epidemic. And it wasn't that the virus itself was so interesting to me back then. It was, hold on a second, my 14-year-old self trying to understand, why would a family kick out a family member who had a virus? Like, why would a virus be a reason for somebody losing their job or their life, you know, at the hands of someone violent? And I think we still haven't managed that, because with Ebola, which is what the poetry book is mostly about, although there's overlap. When I was in Liberia in 2015, I was mostly spending time with Ebola survivors. And I went to the beautiful wedding of 2 Ebola survivors. Incredible, right? They'd gone into those white tents and they had come out not in body bags. It was a feat. They'd lost their parents, their uncles, their cousins, but they survived. And then when they went back home to their village, nobody would dare touch them. There was people wouldn't take their money in the market. They couldn't feed themselves. And one of the poems is about this young woman whose wedding I attended, Salome. She was the one who married another Ebola survivor. They had a gorgeous wedding. And I think a year after I met her, I was back home in DC at the time. And her sister texted me that Salome was pregnant. And she was having pain at home, and no ambulance would come to help her, and she died. She died in childbirth because she was an Ebola survivor, and that was about 14 months after her wedding. And you think that stigma, she survived Ebola, but she didn't survive childbirth because of the stigma.
Or she didn't survive the stigmatization that was happening as part of the public health situation.
And I wrote a piece about her. It was devastating. She survived 2 civil wars and a historic epidemic and died giving birth to a baby girl. And I wrote an article about her in Scientific American, and that article gave way to a poem, 2 poems about her that are in this book.
Well, as an epidemiologist, I would like to talk to you about how we're doing as a species around COVID-19. You know, I think of this as having three phases so far. There was the discovery period before we truly know how far it was spreading, what its characteristics were. I think by the time we get to March, April, at least in the US of last year, we're in the start of this phase, second phase of just lockdown. And now we're beginning to move into the vaccination waves in mass vaccination levels. Could we talk just a little bit about how we're doing as a species on each of those three activities? And I think the
Sure.
verdict is mixed, right?
Very mixed, and also like where, which humans you're talking about, under which governance
Yeah.
in which country. I
Right.
will say that although this pandemic is, the virus is new, the disease is new, the patterns follow many epidemic
Yeah.
patterns in terms of the sometimes being slow to detect, slow to be transparent and share data,
Hmm.
trying to cloak what's really happening, persecuting the whistleblowers.
Hmm.
All of that actually is in keeping with history, unfortunately, in terms of how humans respond to contagion. I think the speed at which we developed vaccines, I mean, unprecedented. But then you have to be really careful in how you communicate that, right? Because I remember when we first got those emergency use authorizations for the mRNA vaccines, I had been writing about vaccines for years. And one very legitimate question I would get is, well, you've been writing about vaccines and you've said over and over that on average, it takes 10 years
Yeah.
to develop a vaccine.
Right.
And the legitimate question was, why should I take one developed in 10 months? And I was saying to scientists that whole time that we were going overdrive in vaccinology to find these vaccines, we should have been working in overdrive on our communications.
Right.
Because otherwise you come up with something that just feels like, well, why would I take something that was developed that quickly? The same thing that was making scientists like jump up and down with joy. Oh my gosh, historic vaccine developed in 10 months, so efficacious, safe. That same piece of data is the same thing making some people say, no way am I getting that. You made it that quick. How do I know what long-term effects are? So just so many shortcomings, shortfallings that repeat themselves. And I tell you, one thing that I worry about is what we call the panic neglect cycle in public health, where we do this all the time. We panic, panic, panic when things are really bad in the acute phase. Then it ends. And then we're like, oh yeah, something really bad happened. Oh, but you know what? It's done now. And it's exactly that kind of approach, for example, to the 2009 H1N1 flu pandemic that led us to depleting the strategic national stockpile in 2009 and not replenishing it, as if we wouldn't need N95 respirators again. Who knows when we would have needed them, but they weren't there when we needed them. So on some counts, we're doing great. The speed of vaccine development, for example. And sadly, in other areas, we just repeat our mistakes.
Right. I mean, 2.8 million people have died globally from this pandemic so far. And you say that this is following the same patterns that we have had throughout history.
Maybe not like the exact same numbers, but yes,
Sure.
the pattern in terms of,
I mean, would you take this back to, the plague in the Middle Ages, or would you start with the Spanish flu? See, we're doing the thing again with naming something for its presumed origin rather than its
and in fact,
behavior.
That's a good point, because actually the reason that got the 1918 flu pandemic came to be known as the Spanish flu is because at that point in World War I, Spain was neutral. And so it was printing news about this flu pandemic when other nations were either not printing as much news or were not being transparent about their troops being infected. So it's really interesting, right? The history of it. It wasn't Spanish in origin, but Spain became synonymous with 1918 and flu for that reason. But yeah, sorry, ask your question again. I got totally sidetracked by that piece of history.
Sorry, so the patterns that we're seeing today and how we are dealing or not dealing with COVID-19, it's following the patterns of history.
But I mean, look at what happened in 2009, right? People were dying, not on this scale. That pandemic was not as bad as this, but it was still a flu pandemic in 2009. I remember when deaths in Mexico were really, really high, and Mexico didn't have enough vaccine. Australia had a surplus of vaccine and was not sending it to Mexico.
Right.
And so, you know, we can say 40% of Americans have received one dose of a COVID vaccine, and that's still not enough. And I agree, we need to vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate.
Yep.
However, we also need to hold in our other hand that about 100 plus countries have not distributed one single dose of vaccine yet.
Yep.
So like in my body right now, I contain more vaccine than 100 nations.
Yep.
And so as if it's good for us just to vaccinate America, are we forgetting that it's like a global pandemic? Like, so that equity part falls down every time. And that's certainly a mistake that's being repeated here.
And even if you, let's for a second leave aside the ethical or moral obligations to our fellow human beings around the planet, our society, we live in such an interconnected world globally
it's bad
right
for
now.
Public health. Yeah, exactly. You know, I say this about prisons too.
Yep.
You may be a person who doesn't feel like there's a moral imperative to give good healthcare to prisoners. Okay, whatever. But you're not realizing how connected you are to people in what you think are far away places. Actually, prisons are porous, right? And it's the same thing with global health. It truly is global. So this idea of like, we'll just get vaccinated and the rest of the world can remain vulnerable, that's how epidemics start, actually. That's how epidemics reach the US.
There's one practical objection that I've been hearing for people who are slow to say, I want the vaccine. I think it's to do with not understanding vaccine efficacy, because we hear stats about 70% or 90% efficacy for the 3 or 4 that are in use, and wondering, what does that really mean? Is that something you can help us understand a little bit? Are these percentages based upon, oh, well, 9 out of 10 people will be protected, or, if I get it, I'll be protected from 9 or 10 exposures, or is it really a measure of what happened during the particular trial?
So a couple of things to know first. Efficacy is referring to data collected in the trial, and effectiveness is what happened in the real world once it was already out there. So that's a thing to be mindful of. Sometimes people use them interchangeably, but they mean 2 different things in this context. The other thing to be mindful of is we talk about efficacy a lot without saying efficacy for what? Because clinical trials are designed to look for different, what we call endpoints. So you might design your trial to see how efficacious is this vaccine at preventing symptoms? How efficacious is this vaccine at keeping you out of hospital because you get so severely sick? Or how efficacious is the vaccine at preventing you from dying? So it's really important to know what we're talking about. We talk about efficacy, but broadly speaking, I would say your definition is correct in terms of letting people know that say for the mRNA vaccines, for example, or the vaccines we have emergency use authorization for, we have actually slightly different efficacies when you look at what the efficacy is for the decreasing chances of mild to moderate disease, and then decreasing chances of severe disease, for example. So it's important to know exactly what's being talked about. I will say that we got kind of blown away when we saw what the efficacy was coming out of these clinical trials. Because if you remember to this time last year, roughly, because vaccines were already being developed, the FDA was saying as a benchmark, what we're looking for is an efficacy of 50%.
Wow.
And we came out with these vaccines that were 94.5, 95% efficacious. That was stunning. And so that's some good news, actually, because the question I get asked a lot as well is, we're in a race between vaccines and variants. Do these vaccines work against the variants? I don't know if you were going to ask me that next, but I get asked that a lot. And because the efficacy is so high already, it gives us what we call a cushion protective factor, in that the vaccines we have in the US actually do a pretty good job protecting against some of the more concerning variants. The efficacy might be lower for those variants compared to the original virus that the vaccines were developed against. But actually, because it was already so high, that's why the protection against even the variants is pretty decent. And I should say, about end of March last year, I think I interviewed some officials at Moderna, and they said to me that I think it was January 6 or 7 that Chinese scientists uploaded the genetic sequence of the coronavirus to the internet. By about 2 or 3 days later, the Moderna scientists had already made the vaccine. So the rest of the year was testing it, as you have to, right? As should be done. But we had come up with this technology, the mRNA technology, that completely sidelined the need to do what you normally do when making a vaccine against viruses, which is growing loads and loads of virus, either to weaken it to include in the vaccine or to kill it. But this was a way of making a viral vaccine that required no virus at all.
What's a 1 or 2 sentence description of the mRNA technology here that most of us would be able to grasp?
The mRNA is the instructions for your own cells, your body, to make the spike protein of the coronavirus. So your cells read it like they're reading a recipe book, and they use the recipe to make a spike protein, not the rest of the virus, just the spike, and they study it. So that should you then get sneezed on or coughed on by somebody and you get exposed to the real spikes on the real virus, your immune system's like, seen this already, got ready for it. Here is our army of antibodies and T cells ready to fight it.
Great, thank you. And would you say that, because we talked about, I think your interest in the HIV prevalence earlier, that some of the learning around how that has worked and how that has spread, and the retroviral therapies that we have seen come on the market as a response, is that affecting our ability to have not just vaccines, but treatments for COVID-19 as well?
That's a good question. We're actually still behind when it comes to developing antivirals. You know, we've had antibiotics for longer than we've had antivirals. And we still don't really have a broad acting antiviral. Because, you know, one thing you can do in the hospital, if someone comes in and you're like, oh my God, they're really sick. I think they're septic. I think it's bacterial. We're going to run loads of tests. But because they're so sick, we're going to treat empirically with a broad acting antibiotic. And hopefully it will wipe out the bug, right? Until we make them feel better, until we figure out exactly what bug it is. And then we'll use a very specific antibiotic. We can't really do that with viruses. We don't have great broad acting antivirals. Even actually the specific antivirals we have for flu, you need to give them within 48 hours of symptoms starting to lessen the duration of the symptoms by 1 to 3 days. You know, we need to be doing a lot better than that. But, you know, to answer your question, I think that science often does build on its knowledge base. Tons of lessons were learned from HIV. One of the reactions I had, you know, when people were like, oh, the vaccines were made too quickly, I feel worried about them. I had a list I was sharing with people of like 7 reasons as to why my explanations for how the vaccines were made so quickly and why that was still safe. But really the end of that list I had written, we need to do the same for every other disease then, because this shows what can be achieved when not just humanity is affected by a pandemic, but Western wealthy nations have their economies impacted by a pandemic, right? The reaction is, we're going to throw billions of dollars at this problem, put our best scientists on it, everyone work together, hurry up. Can we do that for HIV now, please? Can we do that for malaria? Can we do that for dengue? Can we do that for all these other diseases, actually, you know, dengue, malaria of poverty, where people are suffering and we haven't had a vaccine? And dengue, we have had a vaccine, but lots of issues with
it. As we're on deep into the COVID, I'd like to take a couple of questions and then return to the next phase of your work, which is poetry, in a second. But we have one question lining up, which I will now take, which goes to our historical discussion a few minutes ago. It says, if the CDC was in place 70 years ago and had pandemic experience, how is it that we were not better prepared for COVID?
Is the question. Yeah. This makes me really sad. I remember being on CNN in 2014. I think Anderson Cooper came to be outside the hospital where poor Thomas Eric Duncan was dying. The world's media was packed into that parking lot. I think there were so many new satellites going that the doctor's paging system in the hospital collapsed because we were like, just, you know, using up all the bandwidth.
Yeah,
absolutely. And one of the questions he had asked me was something like, you know, are we going to see Ebola spread through Dallas? Or like, you know, people are so scared, want to shut down Texas. Is that like a possibility? And I remember, this is in 2014, saying like, I've been in the CDC, I've been in that machine, and I know what it's capable of doing. And because this is not Liberia, it's not a country that's had its healthcare system decimated by 2 civil wars, we have a public health infrastructure that can contain this. Right? And that was a fair thing to say, and it panned out to be true given how Ebola spread. And then, 2019, 2020. And I think that this was destined to happen in many ways in the context of a virus that spreads through the air and can be spread by asymptomatic people. You know what? I think that part floored us and was pretty unusual. I mean, you think about SARS that happened in 2002, 2003, which is actually a really, really close relative of the new coronavirus. There's lots of homology. That one caused 8,000 infections and 800 deaths because once you got sick, you were in bed. You weren't going to a concert, you weren't going to a ball game, you weren't getting on a packed commuter train, right? But here we had a situation where you could look and feel dandy, go dancing, whatever, and be highly contagious. And so there's different moving pieces to this that made us this vulnerable. Part of it, as I mentioned, there was a lack of pandemic preparedness. We ran out the strategic national stockpile in 2009, didn't replenish it. We didn't listen to the scientists. So you can look in the journals and you'll find it. They were saying not even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, there are coronaviruses in bats that have all the hallmarks of crossing over into humans. There's that possibility, right? We didn't pay enough attention to that. We didn't throw enough money at that problem. And then another moving piece of this is how broken the American healthcare system is. However, you can totally hold me to task over this because the UK's been hit really bad too. And we have a different still an imperfect one, but we have a different healthcare system. So there's so many parts to this. And I will say, it's still mysterious as to why the death rate from COVID is a lot lower in India, a lot lower in Nigeria. I tried to do some of the calculations. Is it about age distribution? Are they older? I don't think it's going to be one thing that explains why some countries have had much higher death rates. It's going to be a number of factors. And here in the US, we can certainly talk to a lack of pandemic preparedness and not funding public health systems enough, in that we have taken so much money away from state public health departments and flatlined the CDC budget for last 4 years. I have to look at my numbers again, but we're basically asking public health departments and the CDC to do a lot more with fewer resources, and that's how we get here.
Well, and I think there will need to be a lot of reckoning with what has worked well and what hasn't worked well and what should have worked better. And I think we're at a moment in time that I would really like you to comment on, because it feels like there are 3 phenomena in play right now. One is the opportunity for vaccination and vaccine deployment. The other, which we didn't talk about, but we mentioned in passing, that there is an opportunity for some of the variants to take hold. And I think we're seeing globally, certainly in the UK and in Europe, a slightly different variation of this phenomena than we are in the US, although that could be just a matter of time. And the third is the opportunity to continue the base protocols of social distancing, mask wearing, and sanitization, with a little testing and contact tracing. Yes, please. But we've got these 3 phenomena that are applying to our moment in time right now. And I'll take Claire's question in context of those 3 phenomena. What would you change today about the US messaging about the current pandemic, given that those 3 things are in play right now?
The messaging. So you know what I would change? Because that part of it, it needs to be conveyed. Please wear a mask. do physical distancing, variants are here, please get vaccinated as soon as you're able. The mistake that we've made from the beginning is a mistake that we make all the time, which is we craft a public health message that's a one-size-fits-all message. And sure, everyone needs access to that information about wearing a mask, why it's important, but we never contextualize it for different communities. And so, and this is what my research does. I'm very passionate about it, because if you talk to 6 people who are quote unquote vaccine hesitant, they're on the fence about vaccines, and you ask them why, you can get 6 radically different reasons. It can be to do with their particular history, their culture, religious beliefs, education. It's so personal. And instead, what we do is everyone just needs to know vaccines are safe, they'll end the pandemic, get vaccinated. That doesn't cut it. And because research is so siloed, communication scholars have been saying for decades, hey, science people, we've been studying the way you do science communication. Here are 11 ways it's deficient. And yet we still keep using the same methods. So what I would change is I would contextualize and make it targeted. And what I would do before putting out the messaging is talking to different communities and saying, what is it that you need to know? What are your biggest concerns? And, I teach this to doctors and nurses who deal with patients who are really against getting vaccinated. And I say to them, we're doing it all wrong. Do you know who's doing it right? The actual hardcore fringe anti-vaccine groups. They're really good at communication. They're really good. And there's a story in here, actually, a very heartbreaking and depressing story about a measles outbreak that happened in Minnesota a few years, very recently, just a couple of years ago. The worst measles outbreak in the state in 30 years. It was horrific. Measles is not like a mild rash. Measles can send kids to the ICU, and measles can leave kids deaf and with permanent brain damage, right? It's not just let them get the virus naturally, they'll fight it off. You want to vaccinate against measles. But what happened about 10 years ago, the Somali community in Minneapolis was just concerned about autism amongst their kids, was wondering if developmental delay was more common in Somali children in the area, in the Minneapolis area. So, this question goes out there. The public health department says, we'll look into it, we'll run the numbers and do an analysis. In the meantime, these anti-vaccine groups are demonstrating lesson number one of good communication. Shut up and listen. Listen to people. You want to be a good communicator. So they are listening, and they hear that the Somali community is really worried about perhaps higher than average developmental delay amongst their kids. The different groups arrive in Minneapolis to hold closed door town halls with Somali parents. And what they say is, we've heard you. You're worried about autism amongst your kids. By the way, you're right. The rates are higher amongst Somali kids. And do you know why this is? It's because you vaccinate at such high rates for MMR. And that was the case. I mean, not that there was any link between MMR and developmental delay, but they were right about the high vaccination coverage, because I think it was around 92 to 94% of Somali kids in the Minneapolis area were vaccinated with the MMR vaccine. Over the course of about 5 to 10 years, these closed door town hall meetings keep happening. They have armed guards at some of them so that journalists can't get in, doctors can't get in. Andrew Wakefield himself, arrives in Minneapolis to kind of convey the same message. They're listening to the concerns. They're offering certainty, and they're offering a story. But even though it's scary, it's a lie. It's a scary lie saying vaccines cause autism. It's giving parents something to believe. The vaccination coverage rate goes from around 92 to 94% to around 40%. Such a drastic drop. And then, of course, a measles outbreak starts. And then the public health department comes back and says, we ran the numbers. And by the way, the autism rates are no higher among Somali children in Minnesota. And the damage is done. And some of these families had come from refugee camps in the Horn of Africa, where they had lost siblings to measles in the refugee camps. And were saying, but we didn't think this could happen in America. We didn't think. anyone could end up in the ICU with measles in America. And it's exactly what happened because the anti-vaccine groups know how to connect with people.
A tragic intersection of partial information, communication issues, and what my takeaway is the lack of transparency. That's part, that transparency has to be part of a communication agenda and strategy.
Yeah. And I always say, David, we train in and practice evidence-based medicine, but we do not practice evidence-based communication.
Yeah. Right.
And I've been getting frustrated at WHO for years. I got in an argument with them years ago before the pandemic because there was a really bad measles outbreak in Eastern Europe, I think Romania. And WHO was advertising proudly the fact that don't worry, it's a really bad outbreak, but we are disseminating pamphlets. And I was like, really? Like, it was not pamphlets that got people to start vaccinating their kids. It was amazing YouTube videos, amazingly emotional YouTube videos of a mother weeping, clutching her child, saying, my child is autistic because of a vaccine. That's what convinced people to not use a life-saving public health intervention. A pamphlet with like bullet points and facts in it, it doesn't cut it. The evidence shows it doesn't cut it. Can we stop doing that?
Right. There's another dimension to this about working in public health and epidemiology that may take you back to your disease detective mode, but the importance of understanding the spread and how that happens, and the importance of trying to track down a patient zero. Like, how are these equally important? Could you help elucidate for us in what context are both of those studies or detective work pieces important? Is one more important than the other?
What are the two that you're asking me to compare?
Looking at spread in general within like community spread, for example, versus going to try and find the first point of contact or the first transmission or the first infection rate.
Yeah, so it depends on the context and depends on the epidemic. Not every epidemic spreads from person to person. Sometimes everyone's drinking from the same water source, right? And the water is your source of contagion. But in other times, I've definitely been investigating epidemics where finding patient zero was really, really important. And I should say, we index case and patient zero sometimes get used interchangeably. The way that I was trained, they meant different things. The index patient was the first one that comes to attention. It's the first person with the symptoms of the disease that is recognized. But patient zero, you trace back further, and it might be a different person who actually was the first to become infected. It's also, again, it can be a stigmatized and loaded term, right? And there's so many reasons and ways in which to be careful in public health that as you do your work, you are not stigmatizing and you are not making people scared. Even the word that we use for this, surveillance, it's a scary word. And to many people, it implies the kinds of authorities that would take away someone's rights or deport somebody, for example, whereas we're using it in a very different term to say, we're not going to deport you. And actually, we can really hurt ourselves with this terminology because people will not want to talk to us because we have government IDs and military uniforms, right? And so often in an epidemic, you will not wear that stuff because you need to find your patient zero and you're not going to find them. When it becomes really important is when you have an epidemic and you are not able to connect all of the dots to figure out exactly who else could be infected, in which case finding your patient zero kind of takes you to the middle of a spider's web kind of diagram and helps you find more hubs of infection, helps you find more points of connection. So it's not always key, but that's when it becomes useful. And I've had definitely multiple epidemics where patient zero was on the run because they were really scared of us and they were homeless and they had issues with the law and there were reasons to potentially be scared of us, even though we weren't going to do anything except for try and get them treatment and figure out who else they've been in touch with.
Yeah, I mean, contact tracing as a term is a little bit more neutral than the full impact of surveillance. And I understand that it's not always a social investigative exercise, but you can actually study the blood samples and looking for dating the points of transmission or the entry of a specific virus into the bloodstream if you have the samples for it.
Yeah, there's a kind of questioning you can do of people. Where did you go? Who did you hang out with? Where do you sleep most nights? What do you do? And then there's the interrogation you can do of the pathogen itself, where you
Yeah.
do kind of like genetic epidemiology, where you're looking at what point did a virus mutate? When did it become a little different? When was
Yeah.
that branching off point? So yeah.
We just used interrogation as another word in this context as well. So,
But I was very mindful of not using it to refer to the person and only to the pathogen. But yeah, again, you have to be so mindful. These terms are incredibly loaded, and yet we just use them as if they don't have an impact on how people perceive public health.
Well, I think part of this is the social and emotional reaction to uncertainty to start with. And we actually want a simple message. So we're all asking the experts to boil it down for us. Whereas I think one of the takeaways from both your book and what we're talking about tonight is there is nuance, there is context, and you really can't avoid facing up to that at the end of the day.
And we have to give people credit that I think people can understand where there's a new epidemic, there's a new pathogen, that there are going to be unanswered questions. I think you have to navigate that carefully as a public health official, as a science communicator, and be mindful that where there are legitimate knowledge gaps, be obvious about those, be transparent, say what you're doing, how you're trying to figure it out, but be mindful that those same gaps in the knowledge are exactly where the snake oil salesmen and women jump into. And what they really exploit is, as you said, our need for kind of filling in the circle of knowledge. And so when someone comes along and says, this gargle, this throat wash will prevent you from getting COVID-19, it can feel really nice to have certainty in something, because they are promising it to you with like 100% conviction. I mean, that's a red flag. And I write about this extensively, what those red flags are in the back of the book, especially, that we have to be mindful of both those things. Yes, there's nuance. Yes, there's always uncertainty. I mean, I kind of like drive myself a little nutty with this sometimes, in that I can just second guess everything because I'm trained to look for limitations in studies. So, but you have to get to a point of comfort, because there's always going to be flaws and limitations and uncertainty. It's finding like, I mean, there's that whole, I'm writing a young adult book about this at the moment. I can't announce more, but one of the things I'm getting the teens who read the book, I hope, to think about is these philosophical problems of etymology, written in teenage terms, but this problem of induction. Has the sun risen every day since the day you were born? Yes. Does that mean the sun will rise tomorrow? Yeah. However, scientists are saying it's an expanding ball of gas that will eventually, like, you know, like, but I can have belief isn't absolute. And belief doesn't have to be binary. Belief can come in degrees and levels. And what you want to do to be safe actually is update your beliefs regularly, where you say, I'm going to be open-minded, I'm going to assess the new evidence, and I'm going to have a different confidence level for different beliefs. Is the sun going to rise tomorrow? Higher level of confidence for that belief than maybe something else. Yeah, I shouldn't go too off topic. I'm just really interested in this idea of like what we should believe and what we should not believe.
I love the fact that you're advocating for teaching logic and rhetoric, which we haven't taught in schools in years, to teenagers. And
here we are, right?
right.
The things that we don't teach and the impact it has. Yeah.
And I would note that your foray into this topic in the book is an appendix called Dr. Yasmin's BS detection kit. So, and that includes a reference to Occam's razor as a way of deciding, you know, what is true and what is likely true, and what is the best solution to take. I'm going to take a few more questions in a couple of minutes, but
sure.
we have started to, I think, go to the social and emotional side of dealing with, in this case, a pandemic. And you have a book of poetry out. So how does an epidemiologist and medical journalist decide a book of poetry is the next project?
So you know how I said to you, I was always a reader, always a reader, a voracious reader. I've always loved poetry, and I've loved the way that poetry can make you feel, like literally feel things, move through emotions. And I think good writing of every genre can absolutely do that. For me, there was something particularly deliberate and delicious and powerful about poetry. And so I never thought I'd be a writer, let alone a poet. But I had been dabbling a bit. And then what happened is when I was in Liberia and I was there with the support of the Pulitzer Center on crisis reporting, I was reporting for Scientific American and PBS and the Dallas Morning News. I was very much there as a journalist, right? But I was also there as a human, and I was attending a wedding, and I was seeing funerals, and I was just witnessing so much human emotion and humanity. And I was thinking about, what are the limits of journalism? Does it have limits? Maybe it doesn't. What even is a genre except for boundaries that we've created? And at what point do you get to push those boundaries? And then I was thinking a lot about this form of documentary poetry, which is not new. It's been around for like hundreds of years. And actually, there's an incredible book from 1938, which I would love to know if you all have a copy of this. It's called The Book of the Dead, and it's by Muriel Rukeyser. And to my knowledge, at least just to me, it's the earliest instance of documentary poetry that I've really engaged with. I'm sure there are older ones. So in 1938, Muriel publishes this book. It's one long poem, which is incredible. It's called The Book of the Dead, and it's about something that really happened in West Virginia in the 30s. Union Carbide had a project of constructing a tunnel. So they get hundreds of men, mostly Black men, to dig the tunnel. The men get this horrific lung disease, silicosis, occupational silicosis. Miners even today still get this, right? Where you're mining, you're chipping away at rock and you breathe in the mineral. And it can essentially kind of give you like a black lung disease. And so hundreds of these Black men died from occupational silicosis. And Muriel Rukeyser writes The Book of the Dead. And it's about this tragedy, but the way that she writes it is based off court trial transcripts, medical documents, interviews, oral histories, family trees, to kind of take you into this tragedy. Of course, she's not the only one. There's been so many poems and books of poetry about documentary poetry, but that was certainly one that really resonated with me. And so at the same time, I was also, a little bit later, but I was also grappling with enjoying this book called Invasive Species by Marwa Hilal. I'm sure you have that book, 'cause it's very recent. And I think she used to be a journalist, and there's one line in her book that says, "Poems do work, journalism can't." And I was thinking about, well, what work can poems do? And there are two incredible poets, Kwame Dawes, who's Jamaican American, I think, and Roger Robinson, who's a Black British Caribbean poet. And both of them in conversation have talked about thinking of poems as empathy machines, as being these generators of empathy. And I was thinking, darn it, if that's not what we're trying to do in journalism, and if that's not what we're trying to do in fiction, and I'll tell you something really, really interesting about epidemics. Scientists have pushed novelists to write novels about epidemics to get presidents to take them seriously. There is US policy under Clinton, I believe, that was influenced by a novel that was commissioned by scientists who were like, if you can make this a good story, and I'm thinking of Richard Preston's earlier books here, and I think it was Joshua Lederberger who instigated it. It was a scientist, I think he was at Stanford, who was like, write a scary novel about a bioterrorism attack against America, where a deadly pathogen, something maybe like Ebola, is, spread to kill the American people. Literally, that novel instigated committee meetings of the president, that he commissioned to be like, this could happen, right? Let's get ready for it. And I just think about the different kinds of impact that different kinds of writing can have. And so I started writing poems, never thinking it would end up in a book, never thinking that the book about viral poems would come out during a pandemic. And not just that, but I don't know if everyone who's here knows this, but there are new Ebola epidemics happening right now, one in Guinea and one in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, not problems that have gone away, right? And I just
right.
maybe even worry about my capacity to always care enough. And that's what I hope these poems do.
Well, we'll try and find a couple of the works that you referenced while we continue talking and share those in the chat if they're available. However, we're talking about poetry, and rather than try and explain poetry, I think it is a U.S. National Poetry Month, and so I'd like to invite you to maybe share a poem, and so we can experience this alternate medium for ourselves.
I'd be happy to. And David, it's National Poetry Month, but it's also National Public Health Week. So it's
let our worlds collide,
read,
right?
I know, let everything collide. So the best time to read poems about epidemics and viruses. So, I mean, there are poems in here that are very much poems about the Ebola survivors whose weddings I was attending and, whose families I was spending time with. Then there are also poems that are reflecting on humanitarian aid agencies and the ways that we respond, and also looking at how journalists cover public health crises. So this poem is called All the News That's Fit to Print. And you might want to think about where you've seen that phrase before. All the news that's fit to print. Dark deaths matter more if they speak English. If our nurses are sent to help and return with trinkets, tans, and meningitis. Editorial judgment dictates at least 16 Black people must die to equal one white man's death. 43 if the outbreak is old news, does not involve profuse hemorrhage, a former colony, or biblical references. Subtract 1 dozen if our boys are deployed to clean up their mess. Add 9 if babies are disintegrating in shallow graves, but restrict to 12 inches maximum. Even maple syrup tastes bitter, licked off fingers inked with destitution. Buttercream pancakes stick in the throat, and it's all happening so far, far away. Follow the story with one reporter who knows nothing of PPE, shrouds, and ritual mourning. Send 4 photogs, overuse 2 underpaid local fixers if deadlines for awards are approaching. Win a Pulitzer for photos of brown faces eating expired medicines smeared in peanut butter aid. Say, it is a gift from the American people. Say, it was worth the ink.
Thank you. The title of this book is interesting, and I think we have a shot of the cover we can actually bring up as well. Would you tell us about how you settled on the title for this book?
Yeah. What had happened was I started writing a poem, and the poem's title had to be If God is a Virus, because some of the poems that I was writing were written from the perspective of the virus itself. And you know what? I was thinking of this idea as viruses being detrimental to humanity, but also being essential to our existence. About 8 to 10% of our genome is viral in origin. You are part virus. And the way our placenta is created, the way it fuses to the uterus, is actually a remnant of a virus we were infected with. So you could argue that you couldn't have humans if you didn't have viruses. And I was grappling with this idea of something that can give death, but also give life. And that made me think of godliness, of some higher power. And so there was this poem, and I titled If God is a Virus, where I was giving a description of what a virus could be like, look like, think like. And then I wrote another poem and another that were part of a series that's scattered throughout the book, which are all by that same title, If God is a Virus. There are also some poems written from the perspective of a virus where the virus is penning a self-help book. Because I thought, actually, who better to write a self-help book for humanity than viruses? They know everything about survival. They know everything about adapting to harsh environments and how to propagate no matter what. Some of the good ones actually make us really sick, but don't kill us, because killing us would be bad for them. So there's this kind of like symbiosis and synergy as well. I liked that series of poems, and so that I decided to use that for the book. Yeah.
This pandemic in particular, and the others that we've talked about, are tragedies. People have lost lives, lost loved ones, lost ways of life. The human approach to grief is often to defer grief until a point where we can deal with it. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts from how you have reported on pandemics in the field across the globe, from your study of history, as to, and I choose to be optimistic that we are coming out of this. It may take us a while. There will be more loss of life, unquestionably, but I choose to be optimistic that we're coming out of this. My question is, what are we in for in terms of coping and the trauma and the grief that is ahead?
I think we are in for a long time of grappling with the after effects of the pandemic. And I think, interestingly, we're talking about this now, but there might be a rush to not grieve and not mourn and to just return to some semblance of reality. I mean, just earlier today, we got the news that the California governor hopes to reopen in the middle of June, like fully reopen the state, right? Which is fantastic if it's safe to do so at that point. And then I think, can we have an announcement about some collective way of grieving, maybe? And it takes me back to Liberia, where I believe at least the families I spent time with said that they had national days of mourning. A national day of mourning for losing loved ones in different ways. And one of the things they were grappling with, of course, during that Ebola epidemic, many of these people were Muslim, not all of them, but many lost their ritualistic ways of being able to bury their dead, right? And we haven't said, we haven't said in the US, you are not allowed to bury your dead. You know, you're not allowed to bury those who've died from COVID. You must cremate them. That would have been fine for some. It would have been horrific for others. I'm Muslim. It would have been so hard, right? For those that I've lost in my family. Gosh, I can't even begin to imagine that. But we still have lost traditional ways of gathering together to grieve. We've had Zoom funerals. Who knew that was ever a thing, or going to, like, what? A Zoom funeral. And so I worry, actually, that we'll lose, I'm hesitant to say silver lining. Maybe I'll just say it with like a big asterisk next to it. I'm hesitant that we'll lose one silver lining of the pandemic, which was, I think, a bigger, broader, more honest conversation about mental health, about grief, and about sadness, and about anxiety, about all those things, that will do the panic neglect cycle with that and be like, oh, it's going to be terrible. Oh, crisis of suicide, or, you know, there hasn't been, but I worry about that. Just then being dropped, like, no, let's all just go back to our normal ways of being, which was like pushing all of that under the rug. And I think we're going to have to fight to care for each other, and fight perhaps for collective, symbolic ways of grieving. And yeah, you're right. You know, we're not out of this yet. The pandemic is still continuing. Things are not looking good in Michigan and Florida right now, but it's never too soon to start having those conversations. And honestly, right now, to me, it just feels like grief upon grief upon grief, and no time to even properly grieve.
I'm going to take one or two quick questions, and then we'll begin to wrap up, and maybe there'll be one more poem that you can share with us towards the end. We have a question from Rachel, which asks, were people's beliefs changed after reading expert rebuttals, such as your debunked column? Because I think what we want to bring about is better information. You know, we talked about this earlier on, but we want to have confidence that the ways of combating misinformation or disinformation will actually be effective.
This is exactly what the final chapter in this book is about. And each chapter in this book is a question, and then the chapter answers the question, or attempts to answer it on the best of my ability based on what evidence we have. But the final chapter in this book about debunking is called Does Debunking a Myth Help It Spread? And I actually answer this question in that chapter because the answer depends on how you do the debunking. And actually, we and our wonderful but bizarre brains do have cognitive biases that when somebody challenges us and says, oh, you know that thing that you believe, actually it's not true and there's this other evidence. Sometimes, not every time, but sometimes that can lead to a backfire effect where you dig your heels in deeper and create more counter arguments to support the falsehood and argue the truth. So in this chapter, gosh, I wonder if this is too frustrating a thing to end on. I'll tell you this, and you can read more in the final chapter, but I talk about this study that was done in the US a few years ago. Scientists took photos of real children who were really, really sick with measles, whooping cough, pertussis, whooping cough is pertussis, but measles, mumps, you know, those kind of vaccine preventable diseases. And these kids are in the NICU, they don't look well. They showed these photos to parents who were perhaps not so keen on getting their kids vaccinated. And part of the argument was like, look at what can happen to children. And the parents looked at the photos and were like, I'm going to vaccinate my kid now. The next year, scientists at a different American university used the exact same photos of sick children on a different group of parents and said, this is what can happen to kids. If you don't vaccinate them, like these diseases are not mild. They can send your kid to the NICU. And the parents were like, well, I am definitely not vaccinating my kid. And you think, wait, what? But this to me, and you can read more in depth about this, but I think to me, one of the things it points to is you can't just go in with a message if you haven't asked a question to begin with. And I get this all the time, you know, when I teach my health communication classes here at Stanford, or I do online ones, people come in like, I want to be a good communicator. Tell me what to say. What do I say? Just tell me, like there's a script. And I'm like, put everything down. Because being a good communicator is about like zip. We have to listen to people. And I think that's a crucial first step that we often really fail at.
So you mentioned the term empathy early on, and I'm just wondering if you would, is that not the right place to start when we're talking about communication?
Yeah, and it's really, really hard. And in fact, one of my communications classes for the med students here at Stanford is called compassion and empathy, because I'm like, there's no good effective communication without compassion and empathy. Like that has to be first and foremost. It's crucial. Sadly, we were dealing with an epidemic of burnout among healthcare workers even before the pandemic. In fact, I designed that class before the pandemic. I tell you, David, it's so depressing. We see signs of that burnout and what we call compassion fatigue in our second year medical students. I'm like, what is it about this system that we are taking passionate people dedicated to a life of patient care and service, and we are zapping all the compassion out of them? So a lot of my work is looking at how do we generate that. It's easier said than done, right? Because imagine everyone's probably like, yeah, compassion, empathy, really important. I mean, I think we all have somebody in our families, I hope it's not just me, who like doesn't want to wear a mask or doesn't want to get vaccinated. It's really hard to have a conversation with them where you're just not like, just wear the freaking mask. And that's not very empathic or empathetic. So, well, but it's very important.
We have a few minutes left, so I would invite you to maybe read one more poem, and maybe there's a comment or a story that you want to end with as well.
Okay, I'll read a poem that's called Smell No Taste, Liberia. Smell No Taste is the name of the village where I spent time with a family with two sisters who had survived Ebola. Smell No Taste, Liberia. This village was named for American soldiers who set up camp and cooked food. Smell the whiteness, it was unseasoned, bland as leavened bread. They did not share, we could not taste. Westerners always bring gifts, expired medicines, peanut butter coated grenades leave craters in soil for mosquitoes to sex in. Teenage lieutenants level dirt tracks with bitumen, priming black roads for a microscopic invasion. Infection coasts along tarmac in a village named for men who do not know how to break bread. They eat alone in boxes. At our table, we sing, bless this food, God bless the seasonings. Bless the sister who mixes rice with soup in her mouth, spits morsels to feed babies who cannot masticate. Pray my child never meets a man who looks at her like target practice. Beg they never return to this village named for unsharing. And if they do, pray they bring even less.
Thank you for sharing that second reading from your book of poetry. Dr. Yasmin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Final thought to leave us with?
Gosh, that's hard. Our conversation's been really broad and interesting for me, at least. So thank you. Read poems. I think that might be my final thought. You know, I also do try and write poems in a way that feels accessible to people who don't normally read them. I have a lot of friends and family who are like, oh, I don't get poems. I don't buy poetry books. I don't read poems. This book is currently 40% off on Haymarket because of National Poetry Month. So yeah, try reading poems if that's not like a regular part of your reading habit, I would say.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for a journey through epidemiology, journalism, medicine, the pandemic and our current reality, and a destination that for now has its home in poetry. So, Dr. Yasmin, thank you again. So to all of you who joined us live tonight, thank you so much. If you're watching afterwards, thank you for taking time to look at and listen to tonight's program. Until next time, please be safe and be well.